Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, Phil Corlett. He's an associate professor at Yale University in the Department of Psychiatry. And I'm very happy that he was able to speak today in the computational psychiatry session. We share an interest in psychosis and delusions, as well as the impact of psychotomimetics on learning and belief formation. Phil did his PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he worked with Trevor Robbins and Paul Fletcher. His research includes identifying the neural circuits and psychological processes supporting delusion formation, delusion maintenance, and the genesis of hallucinations. Recently, Phil examined paranoia in terms of precision-weighted belief updating across a series of studies in humans and rodents. So we're very excited to hear your talk. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, Andrea. It's a pleasure to join you. And you've done an amazing job putting all this together under these uncertain circumstances. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm really interested in psychotic symptoms, which are the sort of profound departures from consensual reality that define serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, but also occur in varying forms and severity across a whole host of different diagnoses, and indeed on a continuum in the healthy population. So we've all had sort of instances of odd and unusual perception, and I'm pretty sure that we all harbor some odd and unusual beliefs when queried. And what we've tried to do in my lab is sort of explore that space, test various different paradigms in healthy people without a psychotic illness, and compare their performance to people with diagnosed psychotic illnesses. And more recently, we've leveraged the power of computational modeling of people's behavior to really draw some interesting distinctions between healthy odd belief and delusion and hallucination too. So I'm going to go through three main topics today in my talk. I'll tell you about some work that we've done around delusion formation. I'll tell you how we've applied some of what we learned to the formation and experience of hallucinations. And then I'll tell you about some really recent work, which Andrea alluded to, on belief updating, which is relevant to paranoia in our data set, but also I think more broadly relevant to both delusions and hallucinations. This is our definition of what a delusion is from the DSM. So they're fixed beliefs, not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. In this most recent version of the definition, the authors chose to point out that sometimes it can be very difficult to distinguish between strongly held ideas and overvalued ideas. And oftentimes it's the degree of conviction with which the belief is held that leads one to classify it as a delusion. What I'm going to show you today are data that it's actually not conviction nor preoccupation that distinguishes delusions from overvalued ideas like conspiracy theories, but actually it's the degree of distress with which someone holds their beliefs. This is an example of something that we call the Capgras delusion, first reported in the 18th century in Paris by some neurologists. This is a 74-year-old married housewife who's diagnosed with psychosis because she believes her husband has been replaced by an unrelated man. So this person looks just like her husband, but she doesn't feel the same emotional attachment or recognition for this person. And critically, it's driving her actions. So she refuses to sleep with the imposter. She locks herself in her bedroom, and she asks her son to procure a gun to protect her against this imposter. Now, I want to be really careful to say that people with psychosis are 14 times more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of violence, but nevertheless, delusions and hallucinations can drive patients to harm themselves and to harm other people. And I think that's another reason to really try our best to try and understand what drives them. The definition of hallucinations is much more simple. So these are percepts without external stimulus, occurring in a conscious and awake state and having the qualities of real perception. Now, again, there's some problems with even this simple definition because, of course, there are hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations that happen as you're falling asleep and you're waking up. I've certainly experienced those. I'm sure some of you have too. But nevertheless, the key point is that hallucinations can be understood with regards to the mechanisms of real perception And delusions can be understood with regards to the mechanisms of belief formation and updating that we know about from cognitive neuroscience research. So that's what I'm going to try and show you today. Here's an example of a typical hallucination. So a 21-year-old university student referred to University Health Services because he's hearing voices in his head. Typically 2 male voices discussing him on average 3 times a week, commenting sometimes on his actions. And in this particular case, he's built a sort of delusional explanation that the security agency MI5, which James Bond is a part of, are plotting to kill him. And this is a tricky part for the data that I'm going to show you today, because in much of the predictive coding work that's been aimed at delusions and hallucinations, the mechanisms and processes that relate to delusion are often different or opposite to those that relate to hallucinations. And I'm going to show you some data along those lines today. And at the very, very end, we're going to discuss why I think that might be. We can capture the brain mechanisms of hallucinations in the scanner. These are data from Ralph Hoffman, the late Ralph Hoffman, and Michelle Hampson at Yale, having people push a button whenever they report hearing a voice in the scanner. And I highlight these data because I think they're really, really interesting. At the 0 time point on the plot on the slide there, that's when the participant pushed the button. That's what's going on in their brains. And the clever analysis that Michelle and Ralph did was to track back in time up to 3 seconds to look at what's going on in the brain and what's forming and fermenting as people are beginning or even before they're reporting having a hallucination, and then what comes online after they've pushed the button. And you can see that cortical regions like the auditory cortex and the insular and right DLPFC and even auditory cortex deactivations are happening before the onset of hallucination and that self-report button push. And the regions of the brain where the drugs that we give to treat psychotic symptoms, the striatum there in the midbrain, those dopamine-rich regions don't seem to be coming online until 3 or 4 seconds after the participant has reported hearing a voice, suggesting to me at least that what we do when we treat with drugs that bind to dopamine receptors is perhaps block the attribution related to the symptom rather than modulating its underlying cortical mechanisms. Delusions don't usually wax and wane, at least on a timescale that can be captured in the scanner in quite the same way. These are just some data from a literature review that I did with an undergrad student here at Yale, looking at regions of the brain that have been damaged, so people who've had a stroke or a closed head injury, and when they've woken up from a coma, they report a monothematic delusion like that Capgras delusion. And so what I'm showing you here are lesions where patients have sustained damage to the frontal cortex, F, the parietal cortex, P, the temporal cortex, T, white matter, W, subcortical regions, S, and occipital regions, O. And I've drawn a line between 2 regions if they were damaged at the same time in the same patient. So the heavier the line, the more frequently that particular part of the brain is damaged at the same time in the same patient. And so you can see there's a preferential accrual of damage to the right hemisphere, but not much of a pattern otherwise, except perhaps some more likely to get damage to the frontal cortex on the right, but a whole host of other regions damaged at the same time. And so what we've been trying to do in the lab is to put some psychological and computational meat on those neurobiological bones. And the way that we've done that is with thinking about things like belief and perception in really, really basic psychological terms. So you'll be familiar with the process of Pavlovian conditioning from Pavlov's sort of classical experiments, where a metronome, not actually a bell ring, was paired with the delivery of some valued stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, a food reward, so this steak. Every time the metronome ticked, the dog would receive a steak, so much so that after a number of repetitions, hearing the metronome would elicit a conditioned response or salivation in the dog because he's expecting to be delivered the steak. In our delusions work, what we've tried to show is exactly the same processes that govern this type of simple conditioning actually govern simple causal learning. So to the extent that humans associate causes and effects, it's the same set of processes that are going on when the dog is associating a metronome with the delivery of a food reward. And with regards to hallucinations, the same processes might be invoked. This time, rather than learning about foods and rewards, we're learning about sensory associations. And I'll come on to that in the middle of my talk. And the model that we have that sort of drives how we think about Pavlovian conditioning is an extremely influential model. It's actually developed here at Yale in the 1970s by two psychologists, Bob Ruscala and Alan Wagner. And it's essentially an overly formal way of saying that we learn from our mistakes, and we learn most when those mistakes are largest. Mistake being the mismatch, that term in parentheses, between what you expect to happen and what you actually experience. That's called prediction error. And in a really nice review of what prediction error is and how it's instantiated in the brain, Wolfram Schultz and Tony Dickinson suggested prediction error relates to the very essence of learning. No learning occurs when outcomes are perfectly predicted. In a nutshell, our model for delusion formation is that prediction error term is happening in people's brains when it really ought not to, and that drives them to attend to and learn about and form beliefs about things that people without psychosis would tend to ignore. We know from Wolfram Schultz's work in monkeys and now replicated in rodents by a whole host of different labs, including Jeff Schoenbaum's, that dopamine neurons in the midbrain seem to report a prediction error signal of sorts. I call this the slide because you've probably seen it in a whole host of the other talks that you've seen in computational neuroscience over the past couple of days, and you probably see it pretty often every time you go to a talk in any kind of psychiatry department. In this slide, what you see is that when the reward is unpredicted by a cue preceding it, so just delivery of a juice reward to the monkey's mouth, you see the dopamine cells get rather excited and fire. However, after training, a cue like a light or the presentation of a visual stimulus on the screen predicts faithfully that reward, you see the dopamine neurons start to respond to the best predictor of that outcome rather than the reward itself. And when you present that predictor, but now don't present the reward, there's a dip below baseline of firing of those cells, a negative prediction error signal. As I mentioned, people like Jeff Schoenbaum have gone on to show that this is the case not just for rewards, but for sensory associations too. And again, that dopamine system, rather than learning the sort of value and changes in the value of stimuli, it's actually learning the causal structure of the environment, which is helpful for us when we think about delusions and hallucinations. So we test that in my lab by having people go into the scanner and imagine that they're an allergist. And their task is to figure out the cause of an allergic reaction in a fictitious patient. So they see meals that he's eaten, like this hamburger on the screen, and their task is to predict whether or not they think he'll have an allergy after eating that hamburger. So you see the hamburger, you make your prediction, and then we show you that after eating the hamburger, your fictitious patient got the allergic response. Every time you see hamburger, he has an allergy. Now, in a subsequent phase of training, after looking at lots of other foods, we show you hamburger paired with a novel food, bananas, that you haven't seen before, and you see that causing an allergy of exactly the same magnitude. According to the Ruscala-Wagner learning rule, there's no prediction error here because the outcome is already perfectly predicted by the presence of the hamburger, so there's nothing new to learn about the bananas. But if our theory of psychosis is correct, when people are actively psychotic and they've got prediction error signals in their brains that they really ought not to have, they might attend to and learn something about the bananas. So we're going to test that. And in a study conducted by Sarah Feinberg that we're currently writing up, although in a whole host of other studies we've shown this too, this is work that she did in the psych emergency room. So the controls here are people who are in the psych emergency room for a whole host of other reasons, but critically not psychotic illness. And you can see when they do the task, they form the appropriate causal beliefs about the banana and the hamburgers. That is, they have a pretty strong prediction and a confident prediction that the hamburger is going to cause the allergic response, and they're pretty equivocal about the bananas. However, if they're patients with psychosis who are in acute psychotic episode, they don't learn enough about the appropriate causal stimulus, the hamburger, and that allows some causal power to creep in and some learning and attention to be allocated to the bananas. So some evidence, we think, behaviorally, that there are aberrant prediction errors in people with psychotic illness. We've done this in the scanner, and we've shown that a region of the brain in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gets pretty heavily engaged when you violate what the participants have learned or inferred about the blocked cue. So if you show the blocked cue causing the allergy, healthy people get rather surprised. Not so much if they're patients with first episode psychosis. The difference between surprising and unsurprising events is somewhat blurred in those patients. The difference in the height between those two bars is much smaller in people with first episode psychosis than it is in age and various other demographically matched controls. And critically, according to our model, the smaller the difference in height between those two bars, the more severe people's delusions are. So this is work I did in grad school with Paul Fletcher, Gary Honey, and Graham Murray. And this relationship with delusions is specific to delusions. So if we add in a partial correlation or a sort of a multiple regression analysis, hallucinations, negative symptoms, medication status, various other features of psychosis that might be confounding, this is the relationship that survives. It's specific to delusions, not any of the other symptoms. We can also model this sort of a process in healthy people. So we can administer people ketamine. It's an anesthetic drug. It's actually, before it became a sort of wonder drug for depression, it was used as a model for psychosis, because when people woke up from their anesthesia, they had some pretty profound psychosis-like experiences, including delusion-like beliefs. This is one example of somebody in one of my studies who I believe had something similar to the Capgras delusion, but actually about me. So she said, every time you left the room, I thought another person dressed in your clothes was coming back into the room. It wasn't scary, just another person dressed in your clothes, doing your job, a little older in age and weighing a little bit more. Now, sadly, both of those things happened to me since I moved to Yale, but not on that actual time scale. I hope you'll agree that this is a delusion-like belief. It's not fully delusional. The person retains a certain degree of insight, but it has enough similar features that we might use it as a model for some of the things that might be going on during delusion formation. When we have people go into the scanner under placebo, we see in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex the nice prediction error signal, right? It's engaged to events that are surprising. It's not very engaged to things that are highly run-of-the-mill or predictable. However, on ketamine, just like in first episode psychosis, important things seem different and different things seem important. The height of those two bars is much less different on ketamine. And again, just like in first episode psychosis, there's a pretty robust relationship between the severity of the delusional beliefs that people experience and inappropriate engagement of that right dorsolateral prefrontal cortical signal. So we think, given what we understand about the effects of ketamine, that aberrant glutamate spillover in that right dorsolateral prefrontal cortical region might be driving prediction errors to be registered when they really ought not to be. And that's what's making people have these odd percepts and odd delusion-like beliefs. Now, as I mentioned, there's a sort of idea of continua wherein I think at least 60% of Americans believe or endorse at least one conspiracy theory. And so we wanted to sort of see if we could explore that variability using our task procedure. And we do that because it turns out from data like Jim Van Os's group in the Netherlands, that there are people out there in the general population who have symptoms and experiences and beliefs that rise to the level of severity or similarity to psychosis and psychotic illness, but nevertheless aren't associated with a need for care. And we wanted to try and explore this space using our task. So we invite people to come to the lab and they complete a questionnaire called the Peters Delusion Inventory. There's about 40 questions. You ask people whether or not they endorse a particular belief. If they say that they do, they're then invited to answer a further 3 questions. How distressing do you find it? How preoccupied are you by it? And how convinced are you that it's true? And in Philippa Garrity and Emmanuel Peters' work, it's possible to find people out in the world who are as convinced and preoccupied as patients are, but it's very rare to find people who are as distressed by their delusion-like ideas as patients with schizophrenia. And so we took that distress regressor and we gave people the blocking task to do in the scanner, and we looked at the relationship between their prediction error signal in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and where they fell on that distress continuum. And indeed, just like under ketamine, just like in first episode psychosis, if you hold your beliefs in a more patient-like way, even though you're a healthy control, your brain responds to our task in a more patient-like way. Some evidence, we think, neurobiological evidence in favor of this idea that there is a continuum, and what's going on along that continuum is similar in people with healthy odd beliefs and in patients with psychotic illnesses. I've shown you these data before. These were the data from the study in the emergency room that Sarah Feinberg conducted. I want to show you just a bit of a wrinkle in the story, lest you think that everything's just straightforward and fits with the model. So these are the data in people who are acutely psychotic. These are the data in people who are chronically psychotic. You can see that even though they take lots of medication, even though they're somewhat convinced that their delusions are true and have held and harbored them for many, many years, their behavior on our task is sort of almost indistinguishable from controls. They perhaps don't learn quite as well, but they don't show any evidence for that aberrant learning about the irrelevant stimulus dimension. And that made us wonder what's going on here. So inspired by our continuum study, we thought distress might be really important. And what we did was have a sample of participants who were acutely ill and this chronic sample complete the Peters delusion inventory just as before. And what we see is those chronic folks whose blocking was sort of intermediate, if you like, from controls relative to those acute patients, and indeed the degree of distress with which they harbored their delusions was intermediate. So we think distress is a really relevant dimension. And as people are more chronically ill and their delusions perhaps fall back from the forefront of their clinical picture, that might be the process that's happening, and that's associated with a sort of normalization of their performance on our blocking task. On the other end, though, we think we can use this behavioral blocking task to predict who might convert from the prodrome. So these are data from young people who haven't yet become psychotically ill, who've completed our task. These are people from the 1984 Finnish birth cohort. So the controls here are age-matched with folks who we think are about to potentially go through a psychotic illness. And what we see is that these are the data from people who are at familial risk. So these are people who have at least one parent who's already psychotic, and you can see that they show some weaker blocking, but it's not completely convincing. However, the people who are at clinical high risk, so these are people who are starting to have more and more of those psychosis-like symptoms, start to have weaker blocking on our task. They start to attend to the bananas and learn about the bananas when they really ought not to. And the people who have both, so both a family member or a parent who is already psychotically ill and are starting to experience some of those attenuated psychotic symptoms, their behavior on the task is much more like our acute sample. So as you can see, as your dose of risk increases, you learn more and more about the irrelevant stimulus. So aberrant prediction errors start to become more and more part of your behavior. So we have a pretty big grant now from the NIH to try and follow up on this and build a series of tools to try and use these types of predictive coding inspired tasks to predict who's going to convert from the prodrome. And we're really excited about that. So just to summarize so far what I've shown you with regards to delusions, early in illness predictions seem to fail and things seem aberrantly salient. Delusions might form because of the explanatory work that they do, and we've been able to model that with ketamine and also relate it to the degree of distress that people experience around their delusions, and we might be able to use that to predict who's going to go on to have delusions subsequently. I'm going to change gears now and talk about hallucinations. I'm really fond of this quote from Karl Jaspers, who's sort of the father of modern psychopathology. He talks about once delusions are formed, that the trail is blazed and participants are now prepared for significant experiences that permeate almost everything that they experience. The now dominant delusion motivates their perceptive schema for all future percepts. So we started thinking about 5 years ago now that beliefs might modulate perception, and that if we maybe marshal some of what we know about belief formation and belief updating, we might be able to get some leverage on hallucinations too, not just delusions. And just as an example of how your beliefs and expectations color what you perceive, this is a rotating mask of Charlie Chaplin's head. As you start to see the inside of the mask, which is rotating clockwise towards you, you might see something odd that happens. Around about now, it might seem to you as though the mask switched direction, and that's because your overwhelming experience with faces is that they tend to point outwards, and that light falls on particular concave versus convex surfaces slightly differently, and your belief that faces point outwards essentially overrode your perceptual inference and led you to conclude that the mask was changing direction rather than that you were looking at the inside of a mask. In a nutshell, again, we think this is what might be happening in people who hallucinate. That is, their perceptual expectations are so strong that they tend to override what they're perceiving. And I'll show you some data in line with that now. Here are some auditory examples. So I'll play you this sample now. Hopefully it works. Did you hear that?
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
So now if I play you the original sample one more time, oh, sorry, let's go back and see if we can get that to work. So this is an example of sine wave speech that's had various frequencies removed from it. I played you the sine wave. I played you the template, which is the original speech from which it was taken.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
And now when I play you the sine wave speech once more, you can now hear not just R2-D2, but the actual underlying structure. And we think that experience of hearing the template has changed your prior expectation such that you can now appropriately infer the content of that sine wave signal. And in some really interesting data from Ben Alderson-Day, who ran this, exposed people who are non-clinical voice hearers, so people who don't have psychosis but do hear voices in their heads, they recognize the sine wave speech much earlier, and they often recognize it even before they've been told that there's any speech to detect, and even before they've been played those templates. And indeed, in some data that I don't have a slide to show you, but it turns out that people in the prodrome also show this sort of an effect. That is, they can detect speech in that sine wave stimulus even before we've told them that there's any speech there, suggesting that maybe their auditory system has a very strong prior expectation that there's speech around, which might be a really nice parsimonious explanation for why people hear voices. And this fits into a set of ideas which I'm sure you've heard a lot about over the past couple of days. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you, but the idea is that cognition, perception, comportment, and action in humans and other animals might be driven by these sorts of predictive coding, inferential type processes. That is, in our brains, there may well be a model for what might be out there in the world, instantiated in the hierarchical organization of our brains. That is, our predictions that there might be speech out there in the world are passed top down from higher levels of the hierarchy. Prediction errors are passed bottom up. And the relative weighting, the contribution of those two things to what we ultimately conclude is weighted by various neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine, all of which have been implicated in the pathogenesis of psychosis. In this case, what we're going to be arguing is that the top-down predictions are overweighted in people who hear voices toward a voice experience as a result of hyperdopaminergia. And this fits in with a line of reasoning from various people, including Hermann von Helmholtz and perhaps even earlier, that perception is to some extent a controlled hallucination. And I'm really fond of this quote from Ivan Pavlov, who says, evidently what the genius Helmholtz, who's really the sort of father of this way of thinking, was referring to in terms of this unconscious inference process is the same mechanism as the conditioned reflex. So we wanted to try and test that in the lab. Is what we see conditioned and conditionable? And are people who have perceptual aberrations, like people with psychosis, are they more or less susceptible to that conditioning process? And this is work with Al Powers in the lab, where we try to induce conditioned hallucinations in people. This has a long history too. These are data from Doug Elson, who was faintly illuminating tungsten filament bulbs at the same time as playing very near to threshold auditory tones. Every time the bulb was illuminated, a tone was presented. And as a result, after a while, Doug Elson could present the bulb very faintly illuminated, and people would report hearing a tone even though no tone was presented. We wanted to try and bring that into sort of modern times and leverage what we know about psychophysics on that process. And so prior to conditioning any percepts, we figured out in the scanner what the threshold was, how intense we had to play these tones to people in order for them to detect them 75% of the time, 50% of the time, which is threshold, 25% of the time, and then of course occasionally we could play no tone at all. So we're doing this over and above the noise of the scanner so we can make sure that people can actually hear the tones, and we're actually acquiring images whilst this is happening. And then in a subsequent phase of what we call training or conditioning, a checkerboard stimulus was paired with one of the tones of one of those intensities over and over again. And we're asking participants to report whether they heard that particular tone. And of course, occasionally we could play the checkerboard, present the checkerboard, and not play a tone. Do people report hearing a tone that we didn't present them with, and what's going on in their brains when they make that report? And to get around some of the problems with the original Doug Elson work around demand characteristics, we actually infused the early phases of training with lots and lots of those above threshold tones. But over time, there's more and more opportunity to make a conditioned hallucination. And we do that in 4 different groups of people. So groups of people who have a psychotic diagnosis, denoted by this P+ here. So in the purple and red, people who have a psychotic illness like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder who hear voices, that's the purple, or don't hear voices, that's in red. So these people just have delusions and negative symptoms. And then, of course, there are the controls who don't have a diagnosed psychotic illness and don't hear voices in their heads. And then there's this really interesting group of non-clinical voice hearers. These are people who believe that they are psychic. They don't meet diagnostic criteria for a psychotic illness, but they do hear daily voices every day in their heads. I can tell you more about those at the end, but you have to believe me, we did various different techniques from forensic psychiatry to convince ourselves that they weren't malingering. They are indeed hearing voices in their heads. They just aren't as distressed or perturbed by that experience. And so how do these people behave on our task? What you see is the 2 voice hearing groups, the clinical and the non-clinical voice hearers, are very, very susceptible to this conditioned hallucination effect. Everybody gets it a little bit, but the 2 voice hearing groups get it about 10 times more strongly than the 2 non-voice hearing groups. So when we collapse across hallucinators versus non-hallucinators, you can see there's a much stronger conditioned hallucination effect in the hallucinators than the non-hallucinators. They are much more likely to report hearing tones that we didn't present them with. And that's particularly the case below threshold, right? So at 50% and 75% intensity, there's not much difference between the groups. However, the 2 hallucinating groups start to diverge from the hallucinators, when the intensities are below threshold. So as uncertainty increases, people start to rely on their prior expectations more, particularly if they're people who hear voices in their heads already. And sensitivity to this effect in the lab correlates with the severity of your voice hearing outside of the lab. When we look in the brain during that thresholding procedure, we see, as we might expect as a sort of sanity check, that there are tone responses in regions of the brain that are tone sensitive. So as the tone intensity waxes and wanes, activity in this superior temporal sulcus region waxes and wanes similarly. We can create a mask out of these regions and apply it during those conditioned hallucination trials. So when people report hearing a tone that we did not present them with, that exact same region of superior temporal sulcus is engaged when they report hearing a tone that we did not present them with. So some evidence that they are actually hearing something, although of course we don't want to engage in too much reverse inference here. When we look outside of that thresholded mask, we see a whole host of other regions of the brain that are typically involved in precision-weighted inference. So the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insular, dopaminergic midbrain regions, and striatal regions too. And rather pleasingly, those regions tend to overlap with the results from those button-pushing experiments that I mentioned at the beginning. So these are data from a meta-analysis by my colleague Renaud Jadry, who looked across all of the studies where people had asked patients who hear voices to push a button in the scanner when you hear a voice. That's the circuit that comes out of that meta-analysis. And these are our data overlaid on that circuit. So I think you'll agree there's fairly pleasing synergy, if you like, between what's going on in the brains when we condition people to hear a tone that we didn't present them with relative to that hallucinated voice experience. The nice thing here is that people don't have to be hallucinating in the scanner, and that we might be able to leverage this as a way of, again, looking at high risk in the program. So again, I don't have a slide on this because these are really new data, but what I can share is that people who are in the prodrome, who are about to convert to psychosis, are much more likely to show conditioned hallucinations too, even before they started to have their own voice hearing experiences. And this is computational neuroscience, so we fit a computational model to their behavior. It's the hierarchical Gaussian filter that was developed by Chris Mathis and colleagues. This is really a model that captures sort of layers of increasing complexity of belief about the task. So at the lowest level, do people believe that tones are occurring in the task? In this mid-level, are those tones being predicted by the presentation of the checkerboards? And at the highest level of belief, are those tone checkerboard associations being updated or becoming more volatile over time? And all of those beliefs are sort of added together and fed through a decision model. And the first thing that we did to sort of convince ourselves that we were in the right space was to use this model, fit it to the behavioral data, and then use the parameters that we estimated to recreate behavior. And as you can see, the behavioral predictions from the simulated data look just like the actual data. So we think that we have a good model here. In terms of the decision temperature, so it was the case that people who heard voices didn't just say yes to everything. They weren't just sort of having a liberal acceptance bias. However, they do tend to overweight their prior beliefs. That was one of the parameters that we added into the model, the extent to which people take into account past experiences in order to weight their current inference. And that was, as we would expect, higher in the people who report hearing voices in their everyday lives. In terms of their perceptual beliefs, people who hear voices were much more likely to believe that the tones were occurring and that those tones were being predicted by the checkerboards. However, the patient groups, both voice hearers and non-voice hearers, started to diverge from the psychics and the control groups at this higher level of the model. They were much less sensitive to the phasic volatility that we injected into the task. They were less likely to perceive and believe that the relationships between the checkerboard and the tone were changing over time compared to the two control groups. So there's a really nice double dissociation here in terms of our computational modeling results. And that fits, I think, with the phenomenology of psychotic illnesses, which is that people tend to have fairly rigid beliefs. However, as I said, I'm going to show you some really recent data in the time that I've got left. I think I've got about 20 minutes or so. I'll show you some data that just came out in eLife recently, and some new data that we've been gathering in the course of the pandemic, if I have time. This is following up on a whole host of work from people like Jim Gold and Jim Waltz and Lawrence DeSerno and Andrea Tu, looking at reversal learning and also other belief updating paradigms in the context of psychotic illnesses. And the result tends to be not that people with psychosis are rigid in their inferences, but actually that they switch fairly promiscuously between response options. So when you look at something like the jumping to conclusions task, where people are drawing beads from one jar or another and trying to decide whether which jar a particular bead is being drawn from, people with psychosis will make their minds up rather quickly, but they don't usually stick to that decision. If you show them more data, they'll actually start to switch back and forth, which is sort of strange when you think about the phenomenology of delusions. As I told you, they're fixed false beliefs. They're not promiscuous false beliefs. And so in the lab recently, what we've been trying to do is sort of understand this excessive switching behavior and to see whether we can use some of the computational tools that I've just shown you to try and pick this apart. We did that, as Andrea mentioned, in humans conducting a probabilistic reversal learning task, and in rats conducting or participating in almost exactly the same task. So we can arrange for contingencies between these card decks and the deliveries of rewards in exactly the same way as we can arrange for contingencies between these nose pokes and the delivery of sucrose rewards in the rats. The key thing here is that we can set up particular expectations that maybe the blue deck is the best compared to these other two, but that will change over time. So for example, it might be the case that 90% of the time the blue deck gives you 100 points, but occasionally leads to a loss of 50 points 10% of the time, and that the other contingencies might hold for those other two card decks. Over time, though, after picking that best deck, say 9 times out of 10, the contingencies might switch. This is a reversal event. So now there's a new best deck, and it's your task to try and switch and find that. It's unsignaled. We tell you beforehand that it might happen, and it's your task to try and figure out when it's happened. And that's a sort of typical or traditional reversal learning task. So you need to learn or figure out when you get a loss, is that just a probabilistic loss, or is it significant that the entire world has changed, the underlying contingencies have changed? And what we added into our task was, having done a few blocks of this 90, 50, 10, again, unsignaled to the participants, we squished the contingencies to 80, 40, and 20. So it became much harder to discern whether when you got a loss, it was actually significant that the underlying rules of the game had changed. Begins easy and it transitions to being more difficult. And we fit a very similarly structured computational model to the one that we fit to our conditioned hallucinations task. So now, at the lowest level of the model, do you believe that you just experienced a win or a loss? How are those wins or losses associated with the different deck colors? And how are those underlying contingencies changing in a volatile way over time? Coupled together with a number of different learning rate parameters that we can estimate across participants. So how stable do you think the deck values are, and what do you initially believe that stability, how stable do you initially believe they'll be before we even show you any data? How do you believe that sort of stability of value changes over time? The lower that value, the more slowly you update your beliefs about the contingency context. And then there are these coupling parameters that govern the impact of that belief on your inferences about deck value. And there are two different ones. There's a tonic and a phasic volatility parameter. They may relate most simply to sort of expected and unexpected uncertainty. And we can estimate those learning rate parameters from the participants' behavior. And we did that in 3 different settings. So we invited people with various different mental health diagnoses into the lab. We assessed their degree of paranoia, and we did the same thing online through Amazon Mechanical Turk. And then, as I mentioned, and Andrea mentioned, we sort of recapitulated the experiment in rats, this time some of whom have been treated with methamphetamine, which is a model for paranoia in healthy or drug-abusing human participants. So the in-lab experiment, we had people go through this transition from easy 90, 50, 10, but reversing to hard 80, 40, 20, and still reversing contingencies. And we had them fill out a standard paranoia questionnaire. So do you think that people are out to harm you? Do you spend a lot of time wondering whether you can trust people, etc.? If you score above 4 on this, we consider you to be a relatively high paranoia participant. And what we find is high paranoia participants in the lab show this excessive switching behavior across the various task blocks. And that's associated with stronger prior beliefs in the volatility of the world, even before we expose you to the task experience. It's also associated with an increase in, as I mentioned, an increase in prior expectancy that the task is going to switch excessively, and stronger unexpected uncertainty driven belief updating. And when we run exactly the same paradigm now on Amazon Mechanical Turk across various different versions of the task now to rule out confounding effects of just sort of doing lots and lots of trials, a quarter of the people just had a stable 90, 50, 10 experience. A quarter of the people had a stable difficult experience, 80, 40, 20, with no switch in the middle. We had people doing our standard version of the task going from 90, 50, 10 to 80, 40, 20, so easy to hard. And then we had some people experience the opposite way around, so hard transitioning to easy. And we can fit exactly the same computational model. And just as before, high paranoia participants, these are our in-lab data, these are the online data. Wherever we solicit high paranoia participants, they engage in this excessive switching behavior. And that's stochastic switching. So we take a measure from behavioral ecology that measures how volatile participants' behavioral choices are, and both in-lab and online, the choices are more volatile. No difference in their persistence or lose stay rates, which is interesting and somewhat surprising, but again, replicated across both of our studies. And as before, exactly the same pattern of model parameters change in laboratory versus online. So even online, healthy participants without any mental health diagnoses have that sort of strong expectation that the world is going to change excessively, coupled with aberrantly high learning rates about phasic and tonic volatility. Across the various task versions, we see exactly what we'd expect. So sort of stable behavior, not as much choice stochasticity difference in the stable versions of the task. However, in the versions that make a transition from easy to hard or hard to easy, there's more choice stochasticity difference between the task blocks. And in terms of the model parameters, again, it's that key version of the task where the transition is from easy to more difficult that pulls apart the different groups of high and low paranoia. We can look at various different confounding factors like demographics, medication use, anxiety and depression scores, and measures of educational attainment and cognitive reflection. And what we find is that the sensitivity to unexpected uncertainty, particularly in that version 3 of the task, survives correction for all of those other confounding variables. When we take the model parameters just as before and try and simulate choices, the simulated data shows exactly the same pattern of excessive choice switching using the parameters that we estimated from the low and the high paranoia participants. So we think we have the right model here. And indeed, when we fit simpler models, they don't capture the differences between the groups. So a simpler HGF model that doesn't have the 3 layers, and also a reinforcement learning model where we weight positive and negative prediction errors differently, again, doesn't capture the differences between our groups. So we think we have the right model here. And when we look at the rat data, so the rats administered with methamphetamine, the data that we were able to gather from our colleagues at Yale, Steph Groman and Jane Taylor and others, didn't have that contingency switch in between, but they're still nevertheless 3-option probabilistic reversal learning data from the rats. And they don't have the same problems with various sort of confounding covariates like diagnoses and socioeconomic status. We can sort of control their experiences a little bit more readily, and we can control their environment too, right? So we expose half of the rats to saline over 23 days or methamphetamine over 23 days, wash them out, and then test them again on the reversal learning task. This is what Steph showed. So under methamphetamine, just like in high paranoia, there's excessive sort of win switch behavior, just as we saw in the paranoid humans. And again, as you can see here, the data from the rat fit to exactly the same computational model show exactly the same pattern of changes compared to the high paranoia humans online and in the lab. So rats on methamphetamine have model parameters that look very, very similar to humans who experience high paranoia. So we wanted to try and test this formally, not just ask you to sort of believe us by eye. And so we entered the parameters from the 3 experiments into a hierarchical cluster analysis. So basically we take all of the parameters from the HGF, fit to the behavioral data from our 3 studies, and we try and see, are there patterns wherein those model parameters sort of travel together? And do they form kind of coherent groups of participants on the basis of those model parameters? And if they do, are there any sort of distinguishing features or commonalities amongst the participants that fall into these groups? And what we find is that we get a 2-cluster solution that's driven mostly by that unexpected uncertainty parameter that relates to how participants update their beliefs in light of changing evidence. It was the one that survived correction for the various confounding factors best. And it also leads to a sort of grouping within clusters wherein the low paranoia humans and saline rats tend to be in the same group, and the high paranoia humans and methamphetamine exposed rats tend to be in the other cluster. So that looks rather like this. And when we look across our yeah.
Phil,
yeah.
Excuse me. We should proceed to the question and answer period.
Okay. All right. I'll be happy to answer any questions. That was my conclusion anyway. So I've shown you that people with delusions have aberrant prediction errors, hallucinations are associated with overweighting of priors, and that how people change their priors and update their beliefs might be relevant to a variety of different sort of transdiagnostic illness states. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for a great talk. I would have loved to also hear more about the insights from the COVID related studies.
Mm-hmm.
So to address some questions, the first one, the hamburger banana issue seems almost akin. The hamburger banana issue seems almost akin to a misunderstanding of the logical OR operator. Is there other evidence that patients with psychosis might not just have issues with prediction, but logical rules in general?
There's a sort of older literature on syllogistic reasoning, but I'm not so sure about sort of computational operators specifically. And in those cases, it's really hard to relate those disruptions specifically to delusions, because they're often confounded by sort of educational challenges and IQ differences between the groups and motivational differences too. So we think that, with our task, things are sort of relatively insensitive to those sort of confounding factors, which, even in the probabilistic reversal learning case, that can be a problem, as you saw. So I tend to shy away from those sort of syllogistic reasoning type tasks.
Is there a relationship between propensity to have non-clinical hallucinations and being perceived as a creative person?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so it's certainly the case that people in more creative pursuits tend to have more unusual beliefs and percepts and sort of be more interested in esoteric ideas. We haven't looked at that in our hands excessively, but I do believe there's a link there. We haven't looked at it with any of the sort of computational tasks that I showed you today, though.
Okay, one of the questions that I posted, so Alex Leff and Julian Leff proposed an avatar therapy for individuals with persecutory auditory verbal hallucinations in 2013, essentially allowing individuals to personalize the voices that they heard, and that reduced the frequency of voices. Based on your model, how does providing an external stimulus for these percepts reduces the frequency?
I think it's a really interesting idea. I'm not totally convinced by the data, if I'm honest, but I could see a way in which this type of predictive coding approach and providing a sort of coherent and potentially controllable explanation for the onset of the voices might be really helpful. So Al Powers and I partner with Claire Bien, who's a member of the Hearing Voices Network here in New Haven, which is sort of like a self-help group for people with voice hearing. And the sorts of techniques that they teach people to do, which involve sort of placing yourself in a much more predictable environment around people that you trust, all might minimize your sort of unexpected uncertainty. And I wonder whether embodying the voice, giving it sort of characteristics, rendering it more understandable and perhaps predictable might be similarly helpful.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question: when you perform experiments like these, is there any concern that you could induce psychotic experience or other symptoms in a control patient for these with these manipulations?
Are you talking about the drug studies?
I guess they're referring to the conditioned hallucination studies.
So I'm not so concerned about those, although there are sort of anecdotal data that the effects last kind of a long time. it's unlikely that people would be exposed to exactly the same checkerboard again. So I'm not so worried about them translating outside of the lab, and if they did, it would simply be the experience of a tone whenever you saw a checkerboard. So that there was one study that I'm aware of from the 1980s in the UK, where at midnight in the UK, when the TV channels closed down, they would play white noise and a tone. In a visual version of the conditioned hallucinations task, the participants were encouraged to pair the presentation of a very faint triangle with the white noise sound, and people did report seeing the triangle on the TV at the time of shutdown. So these things do translate outside of the lab. It's also kind of surprising that they last rather a long time. So we've brought people back to the lab about a year later, and they still continue to report hearing the tone when we present them with exactly the same checkerboard. But because it's in such a constrained association, I'm not so worried about inducing psychosis per se.
Okay, great. Another question. So if I'm right, your model predicts that the very generation of delusions occurs due to the inability of patients to learn from their real mistakes, and thus explain the things that go wrong with the world, with experiences that are unrelated, like the bananas. Mm-hmm. As such, one could possibly trace back the experiences that could have generated larger prediction errors. Potentially, cognitive therapy can help these individuals reassess those experiences. What is your view on this?
I think it's possible. I don't mean to be down on all of these therapies, though, but many of the meta-analyses that I've seen, at least, are suggest that that's rather difficult for people to do. Now, that might be because it takes a lot of work, and perhaps it's even not available to conscious access, what exactly the eliciting sort of experiences or associations were. But in theory, it would be possible if you could find out exactly what those things were. And there's a really interesting, in the very, very first case report of cognitive behavioral therapy from Aaron Beck from the 1950s, he claimed to have done this, to have gone with a person with psychosis and traced back to the sort of eliciting association. I believe that he was a sailor, and it was something to do with people casting aspersions on his sexuality. And Beck was able to work with him and sort of decondition this association that he formed. But like I said, the manualized version of CBT, when we look at the meta-analyses across all of the studies, the effects on psychosis, particularly delusions, are equivocal, I would say. So in theory, it should be possible, but I don't know whether anyone's done it yet.
Great, thank you so much. So now I would like to invite everyone to the trainee session, where we'll have short talks from postdocs and graduate students on the topic of computational psychiatry. Thank you so much, Phil, again, for a wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
And see you in the next session.
Sure.